leveraging the research of our research partners on campus and beyond. We also are training the next generation of policy leaders, and we are engaging with policymakers in various activities, including policy forums, very much like this one. So very much want to welcome you here today. We're doing this policy forum in partnership with the Union of Concerned Scientists, as well as the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. And we also want to thank the University of California Center, Sacramento, which is where we're currently residing. A couple of housekeeping items. If you do need to use the restrooms, they're out that back door to the left. You go down just past or right before the elevators and on your right. There is a code required. For the women, it's 152. For the men, it's 142. If you do forget that or you need information or any other logistical help, either ask in the back Sabrina or out at the registration desk, Maya can help with that. So this is the second forum series, second of the forum series, Delivering the Green, the Future of California's Freight Transportation System. We had our first one a week ago to sort of set the stage, talk about some of the major policies and the motivations for addressing this sector. Don's going to talk a little bit more about that. And then we also have our final in the series, which is going to be on May 10th, which is 2 weeks from today at the same time in the same room. So we encourage you to register for that. The email that you got for this one also has a link if you didn't get a chance to RSVP. We very much encourage you to do that. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to now turn it over to our moderator for today's session, and that is Don Anair, who is the research director of the California Union of Concerned Scientists Clean Vehicles Program. He's got a great bio that you can see. In fact, all of the speakers have their bios in the program. He is the author of a number of reports, including one called Delivering the Green, which happens to be the title of this session or these series here today. We have a lot of UC Davis alum on our panel today as well. Unfortunately, not for Don. He did come from Cornell, but he got his bachelor's and master's degree in electrical engineering from Cornell. So I'm turning it over to you. Take it away, Don.
Let's see here. Thank you, Anthony, for that introduction. First, can folks in the back hear okay? Okay. Jack's telling me maybe a little. How's that? A little better? Okay. So I try not to eat the microphone, but let's see here. So as Anthony mentioned, the Union of Concerned Scientists is co-hosting these events with the Policy Institute and the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. And for some of you who may not be familiar with the Union of Concerned Scientists, we're a national science-based nonprofit putting rigorous independent science to work to solve some of our planet's most pressing problems. And we do that by combining both technical analysis and effective public advocacy to create innovative and practical solutions to some of our big challenges that we face from a planet, from clean air, health, climate change, and energy. And that's why freight transportation is of particular interest to me in working in our clean vehicles program, which is really focused on reducing oil consumption, addressing climate impacts from the transportation sector, as well as the air quality and other public health impacts from our transportation system. So just a little bit quick about today's event. We're going to try to spend the first 60 minutes or so with four presenters that we have today, and try and leave at least the last half an hour for questions from the audience. And the way we're going to do that today is Miriam Swaffer is going to be collecting questions on cards. We're going to do that to try and make sure we try and get to as many questions as we can. So think about your questions as the presenters are presenting, and we're going to hold all the questions until the last half hour of the session, and we'll see how that goes. But so keep an eye out for Miriam. She'll be collecting cards throughout. And let's see here. So I thought it would be helpful to just have a very quick overview of some of the main points we had from last week's forum, which focused on some of the key motivations for getting into and addressing the issues of freight transportation. And for instance, the key role that freight transportation plays in California's economy, and its growing role, and that leading to issues around freight congestion both on the highways and the rail lines, and the importance of freight transportation in terms of the job creation in California, but also the fact that the transportation of goods is really solely dependent on one fuel, that is oil and diesel fuel, and the challenges that presents for the freight network in terms of both vulnerability to price spikes as well as the emissions associated with that. One of the other things, key pieces is climate change emissions. For a number of sectors in California, utilities and light-duty vehicles, we're seeing those emissions actually coming down, even as population increases. For freight, that's not the case. The projections for freight emissions are continuing to grow. So we're not heading in the right direction yet. And we also heard from Professor Ed Abel from USC about some of the public health and community impacts from our freight transportation system, and really clearly pointing out that it's not just the communities that are directly impacted by the freight system near the ports and rail yards, but it's also a huge contributor to regional air quality, and those poor air quality leading to low birth weights, heart rate variability, asthma, cancer, heart attacks, and many more impacts from freight transportation. So finally, we also heard from Jack Katowski of the Air Resources Board about the vision process, looking at how to meet future air quality and deadlines as well as climate change deadlines, and really showing that in the 2023 to 2032, the air quality deadlines really mean that we have to take a big step towards reducing freight emissions. And even if we go 80% below the current emissions on trucks from today, that's not enough to get us to our long-term air quality goals. So we need to be looking at zero-emission freight technologies in order to achieve that. And if we get on the right path towards achieving those air quality deadlines, we'll also be getting on the right path to achieve our climate goals as well. So that's what brings us to this session, which is focused on the technology for rail and trucks and what's needed to get these technologies to a place where we can deploy them and achieve these goals. And so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Ben Sharpe. Ben Sharpe is make sure I get this right, a senior researcher at the International Council on Clean Transportation, as well as a graduate researcher at the Institute for Transportation Studies at UC Davis. So, Ben. Apologize for the mic situation. You can clip it on.
Well, thank you, Don. I appreciate the introduction there. It's really an honor for me to be participating in the forum today. I feel really fortunate to have had the opportunity to continue my PhD program while working at the ICCT the last few years. And I'm actually really excited to share a summary of my dissertation project with you today. So this is just an outline of what I'd like to cover. First, I want to start out with the project motivation and the scope. Then I want to describe briefly some of the methodology I used in the analytical model, which I've called the technology options and pathways for heavy-duty vehicles, HDV. And then I want to briefly go over some kind of high-level results and end up with some conclusions. So as Don summarized really well, I think that last week's forum did a really terrific job of setting the stage for this week's presentations and discussions. The presenters last week did a great job of outlining some of the challenges and impacts posed by the transportation system, and specifically freight vehicles. So in terms of climate change, air quality, energy security, And I think environmental justice is also a topic that we touched on, which was really interesting to me. So in terms of the project that I embarked on a few years ago, what I wanted to do in a nutshell was look at the fleet of heavy-duty vehicles in California and develop some discrete technology evolution scenarios or pathways for the fleet and do kind of a total cost-benefit analysis for each of those discrete technology pathways. So I'm looking, the timeline I'm looking at is 2010 to 2050. So one of the key reasons that I thought a California-centric study looking at trucks and buses would be so interesting is I think that California has really been a real innovator in the area of policy development and implementation for programs targeting emissions and fuel use from heavy-duty vehicles. So I'm not going to go through all the points in this slide in detail, but the main takeaway is that we've really seen a large proliferation of both voluntary and mandatory programs targeting heavy-duty vehicles, and perhaps the most comprehensive kind of suite of policies in the world, arguably. So getting into some of the methodology that I used for this analysis, from an emissions perspective, I took a life cycle approach. So not only looking at vehicle activity, but also looking at the emissions associated with fuel production and transportation. Also did some estimates around vehicle manufacturing. And finally, also wanted to acknowledge some of the energy and emissions associated with scrappage at the end of vehicle life. So in total, these four kind of modules make up the total emissions that I inventory in the tool. So the second major area that I looked at in this analysis are costs. And the first key cost area are for the end users, so the owners and operators of these trucks and buses. So I split that up into two key areas. The first one on the left there are upfront capital costs. So vehicle purchase, as well as in some instances, the capital needed for infrastructure purchase and installation. The second key area on the right is related to vehicle activity. So the main areas there are fuel costs, and also maintenance. So the second kind of key cost area that I tried to put some estimates to are the societal costs that are incurred by the operation of heavy-duty vehicles. And by societal costs, I more or less mean externality costs. So these are impacts that we as a society share, but these costs aren't necessarily paid for by the people who actually own and operate these vehicles. So the four areas I looked at are climate change, air quality, energy security, as well as noise pollution. So now I want to describe these six technology pathway scenarios that I used for this analysis. So the first one is a baseline or kind of business as usual. Kind of my best estimate is how the world would look in the absence of strong regulation in this space. The second one I called high efficiency, and this scenario has much more aggressive improvements in terms of fuel efficiency for new vehicles year to year, and also a more aggressive rollout of hybrid vehicles. The plug-in hybrid and electric vehicle scenario in the orange there has a large proliferation of electrification, so hybrids, plug-in hybrids, electric vehicles. The fourth one there, kind of in purple or gray, is the fuel cell vehicle scenario, which looks at really large adoption of hydrogen across the heavy-duty vehicle applications. The fifth one there in green is an alternative fuel scenario, which has really aggressive rollout of natural gas vehicles in particular, but also looks at transitions to lower carbon natural gas and lower carbon diesel substitutes as well. And then the final scenario, the 80 and 50 there in black, is kind of a kitchen sink, kind of all of the above scenario that has the most aggressive technology adoption, particularly zero emission vehicles. That's necessary to get to an 80% reduction in CO2 equivalent emissions by 2050, as compared to 1990 levels. So before I get into some of the results, I just wanted to acknowledge the real critical importance of technology development and deployment. I think one of the key ideas or findings from this research, which is definitely congruent with studies that were done at the Air Resources Board and also the CalHeat Roadmap, which Fred is going to talk about after me. But the idea that if California is going to reach its air quality and climate goals for the transportation sector, there's going to need to be a large proliferation, really large adoption of zero-emission vehicles across the heavy-duty vehicle fleet. And in particular, I wanted to highlight the need for zero-emission technology in the long-haul trucking sector. This sector, though population-wise doesn't make up a large portion of heavy-duty vehicles in the state, they contribute to a disproportionately high amount of the fuel use and emissions. So I just wanted to show here two of my scenarios, both the fuel cell scenario as well as the 80 and 50 scenario, assume really aggressive adoption rates for hydrogen fuel cell long-haul trucks. And I just wanted to acknowledge that a lot of research and development and deployment would be required if we're actually going to see hydrogen fuel cells kind of penetrate in the long-haul sector. So I just wanted to give an example of some early concepts that we're starting to see in the short-haul and drayage applications. The picture there is a Vision Tyrano, kind of a battery plug-in fuel cell concept. The steps that would be needed to move into kind of a long-haul application would be improvements in hydrogen tank storage on board. Of course, infrastructure is a key enabling area where we need to see a lot of movement. And also in terms of the fuel cell itself, so durability, performance, reliability, etc. So now I just wanted to show a few kind of very high-level results from the project. So this first one is showing CO2 equivalent emissions for each of the 6 scenarios. So on top in red, you have the baseline, what that profile looks like. The bottom black is the 80 and 50 scenario, which reaches the 80% lower levels than 1990 levels by 2050. And then the remaining 4 scenarios are kind of grouped together there in the middle, with the exception being the fuel cell vehicle scenario, which kind of differentiates itself by getting a few, by getting more CO2 emissions over the last decade of the study period. So I wanted to dive in a bit deeper on the 80 and 50 scenario on the next couple slides. So what I'm showing here is the CO2 emission breakdown and where the reductions come from in this scenario. So the gray area there on the bottom is the actual CO2 emissions for the 80 and 50 scenario. And then we have 3 wedges. So the colored wedge on the bottom, the red there, represents the CO2 emission reductions that we get from rolling out zero emission vehicles. The green wedge in the middle represents the benefits that we see from improvements in fuel efficiency in new vehicles from year to year. And then the top wedge there in blue represents the impact of transitioning to lower carbon feedstocks for both natural gas and diesel. So I think the key takeaway, at least for me, from this analysis is that it seems like early on, so in the first half of the study period, the impacts of fuel efficiency improvements in new vehicles is really critical. And as we go out in time, the impacts of adopting zero emission technologies really becomes critical in terms of overall CO2 equivalent reductions. So also wanted to show some costs and how the costs break down. So staying with the 80 and 50 scenario, I just wanted to give you a picture of how the costs shake out. So that bottom wedge there represents vehicle retail costs. The red wedge is fuel costs, and then the large green is maintenance. And then we have the top remaining 5 much smaller wedges there represent the externality costs. So the costs related to emissions, air quality, criteria pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions, the costs due to energy security, as well as noise. So those costs are much lower than the end user costs, which are the 3 bottom ones, the blue, the red, and the green. One of the key things that I tried to model in this project is how individual vehicle costs for advanced technologies are going to decrease as production ramps up. So we can see in this scenario as kind of in the 2025 timeframe, as we start to roll out more and more zero-emission technologies, we have kind of a ramp up of vehicle retail costs. But as we have more and more production, those costs tend to bend downwards, but ultimately start to rise back up as we see. So that's just kind of showing kind of fleet growth over time. But this bump over here represents kind of a learning curve effect. Also, the key message from this slide is that we're seeing the majority of our benefits in terms of overall costs are coming from the fuel savings. So this I just wanted to show very quickly some of a net present value calculation for the 6 scenarios. And the key takeaway for me is that the 80 and 50 scenario really it kind of differentiates itself from the other 4 non-baseline scenarios. But the key caveat there is that there's a higher uncertainty that the 80 and 50 scenario represents. Primarily because, as you would expect, some of these zero-emission technologies, there's some big question marks in terms of vehicle purchase costs, fuel costs, and also maintenance to a certain extent. So just wanted to end with some key ideas. So starting there, just to reiterate, end user costs are really much higher, an order of magnitude higher than the externality costs. And the benefits we see from each of the non-baseline scenarios. So fuel costs are really what's driving the overall benefits. The second bullet there, CO2 reduction breakdown in the 80 and 50 scenario. So in the first half of the study period, we see annual fuel efficiency improvements really kind of driving the overall CO2 reduction picture. And in the second half of the study period, zero emission vehicles and the large proliferation of those technologies are where you get the majority of your CO2 reductions. And just to reiterate, the 80 and 50 scenario provides savings versus the baseline, as well as the other 4 scenarios based on the assumptions and data that I used for this project, which seems to suggest to me that really deep reductions in greenhouse gases and CO2 can be a win-win, not only for society, but for end users as well. So with that, I'd just like to thank you very much for your attention and also acknowledge my committee, as well as the ICCT for their support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. That was excellent. Next up is Let me get the slides going here. As Fred Silver, he comes to us from CALSTART, where he is Vice President, providing executive oversight on the low carbon bus and hydrogen vehicle programs, as well as acting as the Director of the California Hybrid and Efficient Advanced Truck Research Center. Fred, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Don, for having me here today, and I appreciate the folks at UC Davis here, the Policy Institute, for supporting the event as well. Can you all hear me okay back in the back there? Okay, great. So I'm here to talk about some great research that we've been working on for the last 2 years, a team of folks from our Truck Research Center. And you can see that we're focused very much on trying to meet the environmental goals of the state with respect to the heavy-duty and medium-duty truck market. And I've attended a number of presentations on different analysis performed in this area. The challenge we have ahead of us, let me just tell you right now, is daunting. It is not easy. We picked all the cherries off the tree. We really have a challenge ahead of us. Otherwise, we wouldn't have so many folks like Ben and others trying to study the problem. We really have a challenge ahead of us. So this work here, entitled the Research and Market Transformation Roadmap, was done from a group of about 7 folks at the center. And just to tell you a little bit about CalHeat, CalHeat was established by the California Energy Commission and its initial funding and operated by CALSTART, a nonprofit headquartered down in Pasadena, California. The purpose of our center was not only to focus on this research, but also to perform data collection on trucks, just meet with fleets, all the technology suppliers, and basically commercialize and expedite the commercialization of these advanced technologies into the market so we can meet the needs of the state. So one of the areas that we worked on aggressively was this research and market transformation roadmap. It is a grassroots, bottom-up effort from interviewing 40 senior scientists, fleets throughout the country, and other advisors to develop an action plan, coming up ultimately with 66 steps, like Highway 66, right? Just so you remember that. That will get us to approach the 80% reduction in CO2 we need by 2050. The purpose of the action plan was to identify the mini steps necessary. We often take big leaps and skip over important steps. The purpose here is really to develop stepping stones. What are the next logical things that we need to do, the actions we need to do, the logical things to fund, and provide kind of a roadmap for expediting the commercialization of this technology into the market. And it includes everything from research and development, demonstration activities, studies, incentives, policies, and we're trying to leverage that across a variety of technology platforms. So I'll show you the results first. We don't quite get there, just to show you how daunting it is. We get down to about 70%. We need to be at this line here, 80% reduction. This line here represents the business as usual case. We have quite a bit of growth, VMT growth in the state of California. And if you adopt that, you're way up to the sky if we don't do anything about it. So this is this plan gets us about 70% reduction, and we're looking at ways to supplement that in follow-on studies to jump over the chasm and get that full 80% reduction as the plans suggest. In order to do this study, I'll tell you more about the technology in the study. We had 3 different advisory committees. The Technology Advisory Committee, as I mentioned earlier, consists of senior scientists from Eaton, Allison, the truck makers, Kenworth. We've interviewed them, some 40 members of this committee, over a 2-year period to bubble up the roadmap and develop what the next steps are. So these are the senior scientists who are willing to take that next step and tell us what's plausible, and if we were able to fund that work or do other things to kind of move it forward. We also had an extremely good advisory committee. In fact, Ben Sharpe from here, ICCT, was on the committee. We had Jack Katowski, a number, all the air pollution control and air quality management districts had membership on the committee. So we had a really good vetting process and giving us guidance on how to proceed with the study. So, and they also acted as our steering committee as well. So, how did we do this action plan? First of all, we had to kind of descramble the 1.5 million truck inventory in the state as of 2010. And since this is a technology roadmap, most classifications run from class 1 through class 8 or 2 to 8, depending on how you cut the truck market. We felt that it was important to break out the classes of trucks by a combination of factors, which included a duty cycle, weight, usage, VMT, etc. So we ended up with 6 classes of trucks with this combination of factors. Class 7 and 8, the top 2 represent tractors, but the 2 of those actually represent fairly different drive cycles. The over-the-road coaches go cross-country, high-speed travel. Drayage trucks are more urban. Start at the port, they stop at several locations. They go at a little higher speed, but they don't quite continue on day and night and 6 days a week. So a little different duty cycles there, different ownership, different kinds of daily routes. Then we had the vocational work trucks, urban, rural, and intra-city, represented by kind of like refuse collection in the urban setting, cargo and freight delivery, parcel delivery in the rural intra-city section, and work site, where people in some of these applications spend 65% of the day on the side of the road doing something with their engine running, like the utility industry. So it's represented by that. And then we have the class 2 and 3, which incidentally we call the donut hole, because people in this industry kind of have left it out a lot. They cut at 3 or they cut at 1, and nobody's talking much about the class 2B. It's a significant area, and we thought it was important to address this donut hole in this segment. It is represented by a different group of folks. These are the automakers that generally manufacture these trucks versus truck makers and different manufacturers in the other classes of trucks. So in terms of NOx, this chart here it tries to illustrate the impact that we break out the 6 classes of trucks in circles. The big blue circle on the top represents the tractor over-the-road line haul trucks. On the column going down the left side, these are the VMTs, annual VMT for the truck class in that circle. On the bottom side is the population of the truck in California. So the circumference of that truck really represents the amount of NOx from that segment. So as you can see here, it becomes very obvious that the class 7 and 8 trucks represent the preponderant segment related to NOx, also CO2, as you'll see in a moment. So this helps us decide where to put our emphasis and why there are different technologies associated with different classes of trucks. This is another way to look at the data. This is CO2 based, but it's not that different from NOx to CO2. There is some difference, but you'll see there with the 1.5 million trucks in the state that while 56%, right, are in the class 7 and 8 tractors over the road, and CO2, they only represent 20% of the population in trucks, where class 2B and 3 trucks represent 36% of the population. They represent only 12% of the CO2. So we really need to address this tractor and over-the-road segment, and I think that's an area, incidentally, that probably has not been pursued aggressively and enough development activity going into that space. The CalHeat technology focus basically in 2 areas. One area on the left side of the chart there represents advanced electrification, which really starting out with hybrids and moving folks into plug-in hybrids and zero-emission trucks. Technology focus of that activity, and then the right side is focused on engine and driveline activities. We're actually developing new and better engines. I know that the South Coast is coming out with a great RFQ very soon to develop next generation natural gas low NOx engines. We're very excited about that. Those are the kind of things we need to be doing on the right side of the equation here. We know that we're not going to be able to go cross country on batteries. Okay, at least I think that's the case. So we're going to have to develop other ultra low NOx approaches for those applications, and looking towards natural gas, looking towards advanced opposed piston engines, camless engines, and turbines. Purposely designed turbines are new power plants that we could start developing. We need to really come out of the analog age in the engine side and start moving into the digital age. We're really, in my mind, very far behind in terms of what engine technology could be from the research that we've done with the folks that we've been talking to. So if we want to look at a little bit deeper dive on the technologies, you'll see here again, 3 bold numbers: advanced electrification, engine and driveline efficiency, and chassis, body, and roadway systems. These are the 3 areas, very significant areas that need to be dealt with. We focused on the roadmap of the top 2, the advanced electrification, engine and driveline, but we did track what's going on in roadway systems, because there is some great stuff happening on roadway systems. There's platooning the trucks. For example, these trucks can just automatically lock up, almost like with ITS systems, and they actually save 25% CO2 or fuel efficiency by locking up the draft associated with the tractors and doing that. So there are technologies down in this area as well. We did not focus on that in our study. We did look at existing research and bubble that into our study and analysis, but most of our grassroots research in terms of meeting and interviewing folks were focused on the engine and driveline efficiency categories and the advanced electrification categories. So 13 technologies that we investigated, and we worked with the experts in each of these categories. So this represents one of the 13 roadmaps. I won't bore you and go through each of them, but it's important to show you here that along the top section called technology, you'll see 4 boxes that start from a period of time. On the bottom, you'll see it says 2012. That's present. We're in stage 1 technology of hybrids now, moving towards stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4. These are consecutive generations of improved technology. Today, we are not seeing great returns on investments in hybrids without incentives in the state, perhaps a lifetime return on investment without the incentives. When we get to stage 4, we get to 2 to 4 years. So the goal of the roadmap was to develop the actions that are necessary, the policies and the funding that would actually get us to mature technologies by 2020. Now, there is an underpinning assumption here when we do that. These bottom actions help you meet those technology changes at the top. We are assuming there is an assumption of some fairly aggressive phase 2 EPA standards coming around the 2020 timeframe. We'll follow CAFE in light duty, then there's heavy duty is the NHTSA standards. If we don't see those kind of aggressive fuel economy standards, we could probably shift our entire roadmap out 5 to 10 more years, and we go from daunting to really challenging, or much more challenging than what we have here. So the roadmap did produce a number of documents in terms of results. You can see we were able to break out by truck type the different types of drivetrains that might come from these different classes of trucks. The reason these numbers go up is this is based on population of the trucks, which are growing in the state. We used the MFAC data, which is basically state data, to determine that, and we actually are able to show you in the report exactly how, what technologies are most meaningful in which truck classifications. The roadmap infers about an investment of about $500 million, but that's just to kind of get those 13 technologies going, jump-started, and some incentives to kind of get them over the chasm. There's a lot more money we think that'll be necessary, perhaps billions of dollars to pull this through the pipeline when all is said and done with all the technologies, including the fuels. We did not do a deep analysis on fuels and long-term incentives in this study. But we're going to have to fund all these different activities. For the most part, much of the state has been focused on the right side. I know it's politically scary for folks to get involved in the left side of the equation because you're never sure what you're going to get. You know you're going to get a vehicle when it comes out of the right side, but I assure you it is critical for us to do some investment on the left side and do some research and development besides just incentives and pulling through the trucks on the right side of the equation. So you've heard it, you'll probably hear it again and again. The challenge is daunting. There's no more cherries on the trees on this. We're all struggling with studies and working with teams to figure out how to get to meet these low NOx and CO2 regulations that we all aspire to have in the state of California. So we need to focus on getting these funds, our organization is focused on one of the lead roles in pursuing SB 8 and AB 8, which will extend AB 118, and Carl Moyer, 923 funds for fleet turnover. We also think cap and trade funds, significant technology demo funds need to be in place. So we just want to kind of highlight that this is challenging. Even in the best where we have great regulations coming out of the federal government on fuel efficiency standards like we did on the light duty side, right? Doubling the fuel economy on the light duty side. So perhaps there's an opportunity to do that with the truck side as well. That will put us in a much better place. And then a bunch of investment on top of that to get where we need to go. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much for that presentation, Fred. Next up, we have my multitasking abilities are always, here we go. All right, next up we have Henry Hogo from the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Henry is the Assistant Deputy Executive Officer for the Mobile Source Division in the Office of Science and Technology Advancement. And in that role, Henry is responsible for the implementation of the district's clean fleet vehicle rules and the development of mobile source strategies for the management district's air quality management plans, as well as many other things, I'm sure. So, Henry, please.
Thank you, Don, and I want to thank Union Concerned Scientists as well as the Policy Institute for having us here to talk. Actually, something a bit different from trucks, and we're going to talk about rail and locomotives for the remainder of the formal presentations. And you're probably wondering why an Air Pollution Control Agency is involved in technologies. And we actually have been involved in technology development for over 20 years, and it was recognized by the state legislature that in order to meet our air quality standards, that commercialization of advanced clean technologies would be needed. So we actually have a technology advancement office, and similarly in San Joaquin, they have a technology advancement office to push forward commercialization of the cleanest technology. And understanding technology and where they come in play helps us in determining what type of policies that we need to move forward with. The previous speakers indicated that there's going to be a big challenge in meeting air quality standards. This chart shows the top NOx emission sources in the South Coast Air Basin, and they're stacked by the largest sources to the smallest. And as you can see on the top, the largest sources are heavy-duty diesel trucks and ocean-going vessels and locomotives and so forth. But in order to meet the air quality standard for ozone by 2023, we have to get about 65% reduction of NOx emissions. And there are actually, I'm going to say, 3 ozone air quality standards that we have to meet. There's a 1-hour standard that's been vacated, but there's a 1997 8-hour standard that we have to meet by 2023. And there's a newer 2008 ozone standard that we have to meet by 2032. So if you were here for last week's forum, I believe Jack may have had a slide that showed all these standards and a timeline to meet them. Well, we need 65% reduction in NOx to meet the ozone standard by 2023. To meet it by 2032, we're going to need over 75% reduction. So if you look at all these sources, that if they all go to 0, we still don't meet it. So we really have to focus heavily on aggressive replacement of vehicles in order to meet the standard. And the reason for this is that if you look at the top 11 sources of emissions in the South Coast Air Basin, almost all of them are mobile source related. In fact, 9 out of 11 are mobile source related. And the top 5 categories are heavy-duty diesel trucks, off-road equipment, marine vessels. We have our 400 major stationary facilities as the fourth largest. But you see locomotives come in right after in the aircraft. And when we look at the freight movement system, we have to look at not only the trucks, but also the locomotives, the aircraft, and the marine vessel. There's an economic model for moving a container or freight, and that if freight is ultimate destination is within 400 to 500 miles, it's moved by truck. If it's longer than 500 miles, it's moved by rail. So out of our twin ports in Southern California, 40% of the goods actually move nationwide. So you see there's a need to look at rail and locomotive emissions as part of the system. The next two slides, which are in your handout, are actually the different emission standards relative to locomotive engines. The reason I want to put these up is just show the complexity of the emission standards for locomotives. And this table shows the emission standards for locomotives for line haul locomotives, those that travel outside of rail yards in general. So as you can see, when we talk about engine standards for locomotives, we have different tiers. And there are all these tiers that are out there today, except for Tier 4, which will become available beginning in 2015. We believe it will become available. It's actually a requirement by federal law. Not only that, you have emission standards for line haul locomotives. You have a separate emission standard for switch locomotives. These are locomotive engines that are typically around 2,000 horsepower or 2,500 horsepower, operates primarily in rail yards or at intermodal yards at ports to move containers to a yard. And they're used to put different consists together of goods. Typically, a consist of about 100 to 200 rail cars worth of goods that are moved by a set of locomotives. To meet the 2015 standard, the two major engine manufacturers in the U.S., General Electric and EMD, are looking at reducing NOx emissions by essentially 80%, 76% from today's standard. And that means looking at exhaust gas recirculation or selective catalytic reduction. And there are benefits and disadvantages of both. If relative to selective catalytic reduction, typically you use urea as the reductant for SCR technology. And that means carrying a second tank of fuel besides the diesel fuel. So the engine manufacturer is looking at both the urea-based and non-urea-based SCR system. Exhaust gas recirculation may or may not get to the emission standards by 2015, and that's being tested today. Relative to particulate matter, the emissions will have to go way down to almost 90% from today's level. That means the use of diesel oxidation catalysts or particulate filters. And throughout the discussion, as you look at a locomotive by itself, it has the space specification and size specification. So the constraints of putting all these after-treatment technology into a locomotive is a challenge for the engine manufacturers. But they are prototyping Tier 4 locomotives at this time. More recently, the Class 1 railroads have expressed interest in an LNG-powered locomotive. LNG, natural gas-powered locomotives, actually have been around for quite a long time and have been tested on and off by Class 1 railroads as well as smaller railroads. And but the renewed interest in natural gas, because of its abundancy and because of the cost of natural gas at this time, is much cheaper than diesel fuel. There's an economic incentive to look again at LNG locomotives. And current testing is going on with an LNG locomotive operating in Canada, but we believe that there will be, in the next year or so, additional LNG locomotives that will be tested in the U.S. These locomotives only meet a Tier 3 standard at this time. That's the target. And there are no targets for Tier 4 at this point. However, if you want to go, in order for us to meet the air quality standard, we really have to first get the locomotives to be the cleanest possible commercially. But looking into the future, we have to go beyond Tier 4. And what does that mean? And throughout the world, we've seen electric locomotives operating in Europe and in Asia. And these are two examples of locomotives operating in Sweden and a relatively new one operating in China. The one in China, as our understanding, has an equivalent of 13,000 horsepower locomotive operating on an overhead catenary system. And the typical line haul locomotive in the U.S. is around 4,000 to 5,000 horsepower. So that gives you an idea of the capability of an electric locomotive if it was put in use in the U.S. Now, of course, the issue is infrastructure, and not having overhead catenaries running throughout the nation. What would that mean in terms of bringing this technology about? But potentially, this technology could be used more regionally, like commute rails use overhead catenaries, so that there is a possibility for that. The other type of technology that has been talked about are battery hybrid technologies. That if you look at a modern day locomotive, it's actually a diesel electric locomotive. That is, it has an electric engine to provide the traction and propulsion for the locomotive. The diesel engine actually provides the energy to the electric motor. So if you think about if there are ways to decouple the electric motor from the diesel engine portion, we can reduce emissions very significantly. And a hybrid locomotive could do that if there's storage for batteries in such a locomotive. And this is an example that GE had for a while. It's an Evolution hybrid locomotive with the thought that a percentage of the fuel storage tank space would be taken up by batteries. So you get some zero emission, we call it track miles. Just like an automobile, you have an all electric range. This will have an all electric track mile range. And at the bottom over here in yellow, you see actually a battery locomotive car, tender car, that's used in Europe for passenger purposes and for light freight purposes. We have talked to the engine manufacturers about the potential for LNG locomotive to go beyond Tier 4, and that's a good possibility also because the fact that alternative fuels are generally inherently cleaner and doesn't require as much after treatment to get to lower emission reductions, that the complexities of getting to Tier 4 and getting better than Tier 4 are not there relative to a conventional combustion locomotive. In the longer term, there are many concepts out there. The most notable are linear drive systems. You all heard of maglev systems, linear synchronous motor or linear induction motor systems. And they're still being prototyped at this time relative to applicability to freight movement. You've seen them in passenger systems. In Shanghai, there's a maglev system, and that's running fairly well. But when you look at heavier freight systems, those are still being prototyped at this time. There's a photo up here of a prototype up in the Washington area. It's a company called Magnaforce. Has a hybridized, somewhere between a linear induction and linear synchronous motor, but they're permanent magnets, and they're actually prototyping this, and they indicated that they can actually carry about 63,000 pounds on one platform. So it's a technology that's promising. It may fit in more of a niche application rather than a line haul application, but it's something to look at relative to reducing emissions in a certain area. There's also discussions about battery tenders. We all know what a tender car is. It carries fuel. In the 1800s, it was wood. and today is really diesel fuel that's being carried. But today's locomotives don't actually use the tender like in the past. But the LNG locomotives will probably have a tender car associated with. But if you look into the future, perhaps battery technology can improve to the point where we can actually have a bank of batteries in a rail car that can provide the external power to the electric motor. So that concept is actually may not be too far in the future because GE presented some examples of their battery technology and put into stacks and then put into a rail car type system. Another company has a similar approach relative to use of lithium-ion batteries and the potential for that for locomotive operation. And lastly, fuel cell locomotives are being demonstrated today. There's a switch locomotive operating on a fuel cell at this time that's being demonstrated, but the thought that the fuel cell technology can improve to the point where it can actually be used for a line haul locomotive will be hopefully demonstrated in the near future. Outside of the locomotive engine technology, there are other ways to reduce emissions from locomotives, which include looking at bonnet systems, or what we call hood systems, where when the locomotive is idling or in a rail yard where it's going for load testing or maintenance, that we can capture those emissions and just essentially take them out of the air. And lastly, when we look at the network itself, the freight movement network, and what's needed to move goods efficiently, we believe grade separation is one form of an operational efficiency where you would reduce emissions from actually all the vehicles that are idling, waiting for the trains to go across, but also we see areas where trains may get delayed because of some need, because there is no grade separation, and there's a need for the locomotive to wait. I just want to end with a slide that to look at advancing these technology, what type of drivers we would need. Obviously, the need to clean up the air and reduce exposure to harmful emissions is a top priority with us. But in order to move these technologies, they actually can follow Fred's roadmap, essentially in terms of going from research and development mode to a demonstration and then prototyping and ultimate deployment. So we need to do demonstration programs. Also, because of some of the infrastructure needs involved with the different technologies, if it's decided that overhead catenary is the way to go, then that policy direction has to be set, and we need to move forward as a region in order to get those things in place. We're seeing that happening with the high-speed rail, and if some such decisions can be made more regionally, then there is a direction to head with these technology. And to the rail industry, it is a business case, and we've seen that with the LNG interests, and we believe that there is a business case for having even cleaner locomotives or zero-emission locomotives, and continue those discussions with them. But lastly, public funding assistance is always a good incentives, and that carrot part is really necessary in order to move ahead with these technologies. So I thank again for having us here.
Great, thank you, Henry. So that brings the formal presentations to a close. Next up, we basically heard a lot about the different technologies, the need to further develop some of these advanced technologies, and also how to get them into, or how fast we actually need to get them deployed in order to meet our air quality and climate targets. And specifically in the trucking sector, the importance of how those truck technologies are going to move into the fleets, how fleets are going to adopt those technologies is a critical question. And so next up we have Chris Shimoda from the California Trucking Association, where he is the manager of environmental policy. And so Chris is going to provide some perspective from the California Trucking Association's perspective. Okay, thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Don. Just wanted to thank Don and the Union of Concerned Scientists, and also the UC Davis Policy Institute for putting together these forums. I think it's very important that we get together in a room all together and discuss these kind of things and try to hash out a way forward, because these challenges are, as our previous presenters did indicate, immense, and it's going to take a lot of cooperation between private industry and public agencies and nonprofits like Fred's to try to figure out a way forward. So wanted to get into breaking down some of what we talk about when we're talking about challenges with emissions into three specifics, where I think that there are three main categories when we're looking at reductions where the conversations typically lie. So first, greenhouse gases, obviously, this is a global problem. This is not something that's localized to any one particular area. So when we talk about things like fuel efficiency, that's what we're talking about, greenhouse gases. There's been a longstanding toxics issue. This is really a local health impact issue. Criteria pollutants, like Henry's talking about, as far as why are we talking about something like NOx? For anyone who's not in environmental policy, trucking, or someone who needs to know what NOx is, you might say, why are we talking about this particular pollutant? It's really the contribution to ozone, which is regulated under the Clean Air Act, is why we talk about this, and it's really a regional concern. So first, I wanted to talk about some of the existing progress in these three particular areas, to give some context as far as what's already been done, as, you know, let's just call this a learning exercise for how we move forward in the future. So number one, with fuel efficiency, I can tell you that this is one of the areas in heavy duty that has really gotten some of the least attention on the regulatory side in the past few years, but there has been some very encouraging progress, even in the absence of regulatory programs, which if you're talking about, you know, something done by the Air Resources Board, for example, we really have one major regulation, the tractor trailer greenhouse gas reduction measure, which only actually started kicking in a major way in 2013. But I took a look at the diesel consumption numbers from the Board of Equalization today, and I can tell you that despite the fact that we have not had a strong regulatory program in this arena, the 2012 diesel consumption numbers are done, and they're actually at 2003 levels. We have not grown diesel fuel consumption in the state over the past decade. Now, what exactly is it that has caused this? I can tell you that part of it is as the price signal for diesel has increased in the past several years. We're paying close to or over $4 a gallon in the last couple of years, whereas we were paying about $1.50 back in 2003. There has definitely been a response. I can tell you that there is a business case for saving fuel. There is a lot of driver behavior, dispatching patterns, deciding what business you're going to take and what business you're not going to take, that I think has gone into this due to the fact that we're just paying a lot more for fuel right now. So I would like to actually see a lot more analysis on exactly what accounted for the shifts here, but there definitely has been a shift. We're not growing the consumption of diesel lately. On the toxics front, and this kind of dovetails into criteria pollutants, there are some major industry regulations, which you may or may not be aware of. Not to get too far into the weeds on them, but essentially, there are two major emission standards that trucks are going to need to meet in the coming years. There was a 2007 EPA model year requirement that mostly dealt with controlling a pollutant called PM 2.5. I'm sure a lot of you folks know what PM 2.5 is, but for the folks who don't, PM 2.5 is basically what you describe as like a local pollutant. There's near source exposures, that there's all kinds of associated health risks that were covered last week, so I won't go too far into that. But the status of the regs for that is we're almost through complete implementation, where all trucks in the state are going to be very well controlled for PM 2.5. The EPA noted at the ZEV symposium a couple of weeks ago down in the South Coast that soot has been virtually eliminated from these new engines. And what that means is not only is there going to be a local positive health impact, the subject of black carbon was brought up last week. Black carbon as a source from diesel engines actually comes from the soot. So we did get a 2-for-1 benefit there without even really realizing it, black carbon is going to be very well controlled from the current technologies. So as far as NOx, I can tell you that the NOx side of the truck regs kicks in 2023. Everything in the state is going to have to be a 2010 model year or newer. And what that is going to allow is that if you take a look at the vision document, there was some very good modeling done for the truck sector. The existing business as usual case, where there are no additional measures included, just from the current regulations, we're looking at NOx levels at 50% of 2010 levels through 2050. So this is without doing anything else. There's some really incredible progress already in the works right now. So moving forward, acknowledging that even when we get to this very clean level with 2010 and newer technology, that there's going to be some additional progress needed. Number one is for anyone who's coming into this and just now learning about, well, what has been done and where are we going to go in the future, I'd really encourage you to learn more about the burgeoning technologies, some of which were discussed by Fred and Ben. There's some very fascinating stuff going on in the technology vendor world. And also, the more you learn about these technologies, the more you learn about the immense challenges that these are going to face in getting out to the marketplace, how many associated policy issues are going to come up, and that a lot of these new technologies, we're really talking about fundamental paradigm shifts. And what I mean by that is this period that we're coming through right now with truck regulations, we really were not talking about wholesale changes in either the physical infrastructure of roads or the fueling infrastructure. We're really dealing with mostly existing fueling patterns and the existing infrastructure that we have. That is not necessarily going to be the case for some of the approaches that we're talking about right now. For instance, I would say that natural gas is probably one of the more developed alternative fuel infrastructures that we have. If we're talking about something, and just to back up a moment, it took immense effort just to get the existing fueling infrastructure that we have today out there. It's been worked on for over a decade now. If we're talking about something like hydrogen fuel, there is very little work that has been done in that arena so far. So we're really talking about starting from the ground up if hydrogen fuel cell trucks are going to become a dominant paradigm in something like drayage trucks even. So there are a couple of approaches, the turbine engines and then the CAMless engines, that we're really not necessarily talking about wholesale changes, but again, I would just encourage you to learn more about the various approaches so that as we go through these policy discussions in the future, you're really aware of the multiple levels of challenges that we're going to be facing. And to talk about, one of the things that we're already in the midst of doing right now, to put a plug in for this effort, is I'd like to talk about, there's a couple of bills out there right now, AB8 and SB11, which CTA is supporting, that are trying to continue some of the efforts that are positive already on the ground right now. AB8 and SB11 are talking about two particular programs where I know that one of the things that we talk about when we're talking about the future is what do we do in the near term, what do we do in the long term? And I can tell you that these particular bills are dealing with the existing programs that are taking that short-term vision and then also looking at that long-term. The Carl Moyer program is really something that has gotten a lot of near-term technology out on the ground to make the difference in toxics exposure and criteria pollutant exposure for regions right now. AB 118, which is another component of these bills, is taking that longer-term vision toward what kind of alternative technologies can we get out into the marketplace. How do we encourage the development of things like hybrids, natural gas trucks, and into the future, some very advanced engine technologies like hydrogen fuel cell trucks. So that's my plug for AB8 and SB11. Definitely urge you to support those, and looking forward to the question and answer portion today. Thank you.